Christ is risen from the dead, trampling over death by death. Come awake, come awake, come and rise up from the grave. Christ is risen from the dead.
For the last 3 weeks, or this is the third week, we have heard stories about people who were brokenhearted, people who felt lost, who felt like all of their dreams and hopes had been shattered. And then they had an encounter with the risen Lord, and everything changed. We started with Mary Magdalene on Easter Sunday, and how she went to the tomb, the only thing she had left, the only thing else she could do for her friend who had died was simply to come and weep at his tomb. And she encountered him, and he called her by name. Then last week we had the story of the disciples in the upper room. And Jesus came through the wall, much like he's doing here. And suddenly they realized that he was alive. And then there was doubting Thomas, who missed that, so he came again the following week. And he said, Thomas, put your fingers into the nail wounds. Put your hand into my side and believe. And Thomas believed. And now today we have the story of Cleophas and the other disciple. Again, in dark times, everything they had hoped for, everything they had worked for seems crushed and gone. Now the only thing they can think to do is go back where they came from. Try to pick up the broken pieces of their lives and carry on as best they can. And so they leave Jerusalem. Now, to head out toward in the direction of Emmaus, unless you want to walk a very long way all around the outside of the city, the gate that goes happens to go right past Calvary. And up on the top of the hill would still be the 3 crosses as the disciples came out. I'm sure if they looked up, it probably made their blood run cold as they remembered what they had lost. And they go on down the road a ways, and a stranger comes along. And he sees them there, and he says, what's wrong with you guys, right? You're looking so hangdog. What's wrong? And, the disciple, or Cleophas and the other disciple look at him, and it's kind of like, what, you been living in a hole? Don't you know what's happened here? No, what's happened? About Jesus from Nazareth. This powerful prophet. We really thought he was the Messiah. We really thought he was the Christ. Now he's been executed, and everything is lost. Now, Jesus is much too polite to say something like this. I would probably say it, but he wouldn't. Look at them and say, man, you guys are dumber than a sack full of hammers. You know that? He just simply gently says, oh, how foolish you are. And then he begins to tell them from Scripture, beginning with Moses and working his way all the way through, that the Messiah, the Christ, had to suffer, had to die. That's the sign of the true Messiah, that he would die and rise again. And so, as they're walking along, suddenly the light begins to shine for them again. They feel warm inside. They feel as though their hope is beginning to revive, as if maybe everything isn't lost. Well, they get to the village, and Jesus acts like he's going to go on, the stranger. And so they say, oh, please, sir, stay with us tonight. Have dinner with us. They just don't want to lose him yet. So he agrees, and they come in, and they sit down at table. And he takes some bread. He says the blessing. He breaks the bread, and he gives it to them. And suddenly, in the breaking of the bread, they know him. Their eyes are opened. He's alive. He's alive. Great God in heaven. Jesus is alive. And at that moment, he vanishes. And they're so filled with excitement because they realize he's not dead. Everything is not lost. They've not been abandoned. They've not been forgotten. And they go rushing back to Jerusalem to tell everybody. These are wonderful stories, aren't they? But what about today? 20 centuries later, what about us? When we feel as lost as Mary Magdalene, as confused as the disciples, as defeated as Cleophas and the other disciple, what about us? The answer to that comes from a letter on the Eucharistic year written by Blessed John Paul II. When the disciples on the way to Emmaus asked Jesus to stay with them, he responded by giving them a much greater gift. Through the sacrament of the Eucharist, he found a way to stay in them. Receiving Eucharist means entering into a profound communion with Jesus. Abide in me, as I in you. John 15:4. This relationship of profound and mutual abiding enables us to have a certain foretaste of heaven on earth. Is this not the greatest of human yearnings? Is this not what God had in mind when he brought about in history his plan of salvation? God has placed in the human hearts a hunger for his word, a hunger which will be satisfied only by full union with him. Eucharistic communion was given so that we might be sated with God here on earth in expectation of our complete fulfillment in heaven. As the Holy Father is saying there, the Jesus who appears to us in the Eucharist is the same risen Jesus who appeared to Mary Magdalene, to the disciples and Thomas, to Cleophas and the other disciple. You know, that's why, if you read in the Gospel of Luke, that other disciple is never identified. The reason for that is because I am the other disciple. I met Jesus in Emmaus, only it was called St. Paul's Newman Center, the University of Wyoming, 26 years ago. You are the other disciple. Every time we open ourselves up and remember that Jesus is truly, fully present in the Eucharist, the risen Lord here to say, you're not abandoned, you're not forgotten, you're not left in the dark. Now, for some folks, might just say, well, Father, when that happened to you, you were desperate. You were searching. Just like Mary Magdalene was desperate, just like the disciples were desperate, just like Cleophas was desperate. And your mind played tricks on you. That's all that happened. I don't think so. Mind tricks would not have lasted for 20 centuries. But more than that, we have another story I want to share with you about this. It's one you've all heard before. You remember Deacon Eddie Ainsley, who was here 2 years ago to give our Advent retreat or mission. And he told his story. Now, Eddie was not somebody who was desperate. He was not somebody who was lost. He was not somebody who was hurting. In fact, as far as he knew, everything was going just the way he wanted them to. He, was raised in the South, in Georgia. Really didn't know anything about the Catholic Church. All he'd ever heard about Catholics was from his anti-Catholic uncle, who said that, Catholics were just fish-eating, knee-bending idol worshipers. And that was about it. He himself was a Presbyterian. He had wanted to dedicate his life to serving Christ. And so he was in the Presbyterian seminary in Alabama. And it was his last semester. In a couple of weeks, he would graduate. He had already been talking with a church that was going to give him his first call so that he could be ordained. Everything was just as he had hoped and dreamed. Then he went home for Easter. He figured, kind of like me, if he didn't grab this last opportunity to be with his family at Easter, he'd probably never get the chance again because, after all, Easter is one of our busy seasons. So he got in his car and he starts to drive back from Alabama into Georgia. And as he's driving along, he happens to pass through a small town, and he sees a sign that says there's a Catholic church. Well, he's always been curious about Catholics, so he decides, why not go and see this place? I'm not in that big a hurry. So he turns off and he drives into this little town, and he finds the church. And he gets out of his car, and he's hoping that the door is unlocked, and he tries it, and sure enough, he opens it up. He looks inside, and he's very disappointed. Looks pretty much like he's used to. There's a pulpit, there's an ambo, there's a table, an altar. Of course, there are a whole bunch of statues, but he figured that after all, they're idol worshipers. But then he sees behind the altar there's this gold box. And he said he could not take his eyes off that box. And then something started to draw him right down the center aisle of that little church. He came right down to the front. He stepped into a pew, and he felt this overwhelming urge to kneel. Remember, I used to be a Presbyterian too, and I can tell you that knee bending in the Presbyterian church, you do that. You kneel during worship. And yet he felt the need to do that. And he knelt there just staring at that gold box. And then he said he was like flooded with warmth and a joy and a peace he had never experienced before in his life came upon him. Those of you that were there may remember he said, at that point I told myself, Eddie, if you don't get out of here, you're going to become a Roman Catholic. And then he looked down at his deacon vestments and said, obviously I didn't run fast enough. That was his moment at Emmaus. That moment when he met the risen Lord just as surely as Mary Magdalene did, just as surely as the apostles did, just as surely as Cleophas did. If you feel lost, you're not sure of the way, if life seems a bit dark or confused, remember, you are not forgotten. You're not abandoned. You're not left alone. He's right here. This is Emmaus, and you are the other disciple, if you're willing to see him in the breaking of the bread. Now let us stand and profess what we believe. We believe